The leaders of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan have agreed to make their trilateral cooperation regular and institutional during their Camp David Trilateral Summit last Friday. But given that it was a political agreement, how far will it go and will it last? We have our top office correspondent back in Seoul to break down some key questions. Welcome back, Sooyoung.
It's lovely to be here, Tammy.
All right. I hope you're not too jet-lagged.
Oh, hopefully not.
All right, let's first begin how significant the summit was in setting forth a new era in their trilateral relations between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo.
Right, it really has to be said how determined and united that the three leaders were on really confronting threats and challenges together. First, it was pretty remarkable how they were aligning their values and visions, not only vaguely for the peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific, as it's been mentioned various times, but with the kind of meticulous and unprecedented details like supporting a free and united Korean Peninsula, something Japan and the United States weren't all too concerned about before, and the mention of North Korea's abduction of foreign nationals, which was always an important issue for Japan. Second, the scope of cooperation between the three countries. It went beyond countering North Korea to become a very wide-ranging and very practical framework, which also touched upon the kind of ethical kind of issues as well. For instance, strengthening supply chain cooperation with early warning systems, collaborations between their leading scientists and the top institutions, to setting artificial intelligence standards and also jointly assisting development projects in the Indo-Pacific region, the Pacific Island countries, and Ukraine as well. So the three countries are really going to work together with one another across all dimensions in every possible way imaginable. In fact, they're moving as one as they engage with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Pacific Islands, security initiatives like AUKUS and the Quad, really becoming this an independent entity, as Seoul's top office said, in the Indo-Pacific region.
Right, Sooyoung, I do have to mention, Beijing has been quite concerned or rather critical of this trilateral cooperation, right? And it also mentioned by its activities or its behavior in the South China Sea. Can you tell us more about that?
Right, so for now, it's quite clear that the three-way security cooperation is focused on deterring North Korea's threat. But then, and of course, it still hinges on the two separate ROK-US and US-Japan alliances. But again, that does leave room for more developments if needed, and officials aren't ruling anything out at this point. The so-called commitment to consult, now that's not binding as has been mentioned, but it's still quite remarkable how the three countries are going to immediately consult each other and jointly address emerging threats, whether that's security or trade. Now, on that note, it's quite clear that China is becoming a growing threat to all three nations for a number of reasons. President Yoon himself, he said that the rule of law and the freedom of navigation, the freedom in the South China Sea is essential for the peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific, and that is very much in line with South Korea's liberal democratic values. And also disrupting peace in regional waters, that not only affects security, but also the really important sea lines, the lines of communication, which are essential for South Korea's export-dependent economy. Not to mention, Beijing hasn't entirely been helpful in suppressing North Korea's nuclear and missile program, nor has its economic coercion done it any favors as far as the Korean or Japanese publics are concerned, with over 70% of each public seeing China as a threat. Now, Seoul has reasonably maintained that it wishes to have a mutually respectful relationship with China, with the National Security Advisor saying on Sunday that talks are ongoing to resume a three-way dialogue with Tokyo and Beijing at the top level. Thus, experts say that the scope of South Korea, the US and Japan's security framework may ironically depend very largely on whether China chooses to dial down its aggressive behavior or not.
Right, so I mentioned this earlier, that one of the most important aspects of this trilateral summit was institutionalizing their trilateral cooperation. The question is, though, is it sustainable?
Right, so that question of continuity, that really remains to be seen, as it's not legally binding, as you mentioned, and relies rather heavily on political will. The long-standing disputes, of course, arising from Japan's brutal colonization of South Korea in the early 20th century, that's been a huge emotional trigger point that was often politicized on both sides, making these issues a matter of national dignity. Thus, much of the focus has been on whether Seoul and Tokyo can keep the momentum going in improving their relations beyond this current administration, particularly with key elections coming up for both countries. And experts also say that US politics is somewhat of a growing risk factor as well?
It's pretty clear to me that one of the concerns that was driving the need to institutionalize and formalize and concretize, if that's a word, this emerging relationship was the possibility that the United States might, after November or January of 2025, have back in power a president who is not committed to these partnerships that we have with these two critically important Asian allies.
Well, executive leadership has been very crucial. Going forward, it would require broader institutionalization to solidify and amplify cooperation.
But there's obviously an important security dimension to this partnership. There's an important economic and trade dimension to this partnership. There's a diplomatic dimension to this partnership. There are so many areas that are going to provide fodder, if you will, for cooperation, coordination among the three countries here, that I think that the legislatures in all three countries, in my view, have a stake, have an interest in participating in this emerging partnership, and I hope they will.
Right, lots of dimensions to cooperate and collaborate in economy, security, defense, you name it. But the question is, why is it so critical, the trilateral cooperation, so important for South Korea? Does it matter for the average South Korean public?
Right, that's a very good question indeed. And well, for South Korea and South Koreans, increasing trilateral cooperation with the US, with Japan, is a crucial step, not only in terms of overcoming the country's most immediate security threat, namely North Korea, but also expanding its role in the world as a liberal democracy, protecting human rights, freedom, and the rule of law with its partners across the world. It's also a matter of safeguarding the livelihoods of South Korean citizens, according to presidential spokesperson Lee Dawn.
If all three countries expand technological and people-to-people exchanges, especially in cutting-edge fields such as AI, space and quantum tech, not only will they secure future growth engines, but they can also lead to direct economic effects such as job creation, increasing the size of the economy. Then, as industries becoming more sophisticated and more jobs are created, a virtuous cycle would increase overall welfare.
Sooyoung, before I let you go, I'm curious when and where when we actually see the next trilateral summit?
Right, well, for now, the leaders are going to have to wait and see when to hold their standalone summit. But we do know that President Yoon has suggested meeting in South Korea, as the leaders have already met this year in Hiroshima, Japan, and also now Camp David in America. But in the meantime, though, they are likely to hold these sideline summits when they have these global conferences. So they will be catching up quite frequently, I imagine.
I imagine too. All right, thanks always for your coverage, Sooyoung. Nice to see you back in Seoul.
Yeah, lovely to be here, Tammy. Thank you.
All right.